What's going on, y'all? KM Best here with another Marvel Snap Hot Takes video, and I gotta wear shades because these takes are so hot, they're burning my eyes. Number one, from Jeff Hoagland, Marvel Snap's card acquisition is actually one of the better systems in mobile card games that you will find. I tend to think that this comes with arguments both for and against, because I think that Marvel Snap's early game card acquisition is phenomenal in terms of the amount of generosity that the game shows to you. You get all these cards in Series 1, all these cards in Series 2, and these are not filler cards, right? I think in a lot of other card games, the stuff you get for free tends to be filler. And the cards you get in Series 1 and Series 2 are played all the way through to endgame meta decks. Cards like Blue Marvel, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, Iceman, Korg. These are critical pieces to endgame meta decks, but the issue that you run into is that those endgame meta decks, the way Marvel Snap's acquisition is set up, a lot of those endgame meta decks will only be acquirable by getting, one or two cards in Series 4 and Series 5. So you end up creating this situation where a lot of people have 10 of the 12 cards needed for a meta deck, but not the key piece. Think Darkhawk without Zabu or Darkhawk without Darkhawk, right? They end up having everything but the thing they want, and so then they feel like they are forced into buying those cards. And that, I think, creates a lot of the perception around Marvel Snap being a game that is not free-to-play friendly, because frankly, when is the last time there was a full Series 3 deck that was legitimately endgame playable? I think it's been a very long time. I think the last time I can think about that being true was probably Leader deck. Was the Leader Dino meta was probably the last time that there was a pure Series 3 deck that was only Series 3 cards. That was one of the best decks in the game. And since then, I think basically every deck has required a Series 5 card, a Battle Pass card, a Series 4 card, at the very least, usually multiple. And I do think that that is worth pointing out, that it has no longer the generosity, the amount by which you can compete with a Pool 2 deck, with early game cards in the end game. I think as cards have gotten stronger, and I think cards probably have gotten stronger, it has gotten harder to compete with those Pool 1, Pool 2 cards in the end game. And I do think that's worth pointing out. So while Marvel Snap is very generous at first, I do think the way in which it is generous creates the conditions for the bad feelings later on down the line when you're missing two cards and the price tag on those cards is very, very large. A take from a friend of mine, the Human Spider, says, cost reduction makes the game more interesting and fun. I actually think this is undeniable. A lot of people point at cost reduction as like, oh, it's so broken, they should just never do it. But in a game where you fundamentally only have 21 energy, and you fundamentally only have 6 turns, playing with those fundamentals is going to create dynamic and interesting and fun things to do. And I see no issues with exploring the space, although traditionally it has been extremely powerful. Especially now that Mobius exists, I see even less issues with exploring the space. But I do think that it is something that makes games more dynamic. It is something that increases the, I guess you'd say, a variance in terms of what you can expect to see. Because if it weren't for cost reduction, I think a lot of strategies sort of wouldn't exist. It would be very blocky, linear mid-range decks or very over-the-top combo decks, and cost reduction allows decks to move around in that space. So I would definitely agree that cost reduction is a thing they should keep exploring. I do think some of the numbers they have tended to put on cost reduction have been problematic, and I do have some sympathy to the people who are like, well, why don't they just never make cost reduction? Because it would be an easy problem, but it'd be a very boring solution. This is a big one. They should have never nerfed Arrow. Okay, so I disagree with this, specifically because, we see what's happening with Elith right now. We see how much people hate Elith. We see how, awful that is, and Arrow is a better version of that. But I am sort of sympathetic to the argument, because when Arrow was the best card at the 5-cost slot when she was just default amazing, great card. You'd run her in basically everything. She was in every deck from Shuri to Tempo decks, right? Just every deck would run her. What she served as was a natural inbuilt counter to Galactus. And now that she is no longer that, now that decks can no longer afford to just like best in slot also happens to counter Galactus. Imagine if Jeff or Doctor Doom just happened to counter Galactus, right? It was like that, right? The best card in the slot happened to also dunk on one of the most unfun cards in the game, and that made it a sort of risky proposition to play Galactus. But the issue with Arrow is similar to the issue with Elith. When you look at the Arrow tempo decks, right? The get ahead and then wave the arrow thing, right? Like that really sucks to play against, and I would argue it sucks worse than playing against Elith. I think Elith is a distinct third place in terms of being a finisher, because what Arrow would do is Arrow would finish you from any lane. Any lane. It didn't matter what it was. If they were ahead, they could make the game over. Elith, they need to actually put it in the lane where you play stuff. They need to do things like that. They need to maybe play Jean Grey in order to make sure that happens, or read your play. Things like that that actually involve, you know, gameplay. And with Arrow, there was none of that. With Leader, there was even less. And so I think Elith being a distinct third is, to my mind, actually a good justification for how Elith could result in a Galactus nerf without that being Elith's fault necessarily, because Galactus is the one deck where Elith is doing that super linear thing everyone hates, that Leader Arrow thing where it's just deterministic, and every other deck that's trying to leverage Elith in that way would leverage Arrow better and would leverage Old Leader better. It's just Elith is like the budget version of those. I'm going to say right now, I think this one is the worst take of the entire bunch. Galactus never needed a nerf in the first place, and people overreact to his playstyle. That's like terrible, awful take. One of the worst takes I've ever seen on this, and I'll explain why, especially in the context of Galactus right now. It is just absolutely insane to look at this card that has gotten nerfed twice and is still one of the better cards in the game. Still a card people absolutely hate playing against, and then be like, they shouldn't have nerfed it the first time. So Galactus at 6-2 right now would be, with his old ability, would be the best card in the game, and it would not be close because of the lack of ways people have to interact with it. I actually have been on record here. The Galactus nerf was probably the best thing they've ever done, not necessarily because of anything specific, but because they gave every deck a lever to interact with it, right? Now every deck just has to get above 5. They changed it from 7, but it used to be 7. And if you can get above 5, you are immune to Galactus. Previously, the games were sort of decided in deck building. And I think Galactus's biggest crime is it stripped the artifice of Marvel Snap down. There are a lot of cards in Marvel Snap, and Marvel Snap's location system has a bunch of inherent complexity in the sense that you have to pick and choose where you're going to put your power, and that is an inherently engaging experience. And Galactus took all of that out of the game, and in so doing, made the game feel bad to play, right? It was just, oh, did they do the thing to me? And did I put a debris in my deck before this, right? People like to talk about all the cards that supposedly counter Galactus, but it was not necessarily what people want to be doing. People don't want to have to run 2 counter cards in their deck for one matchup that don't do what their deck does. And I think that's the other thing Galactus did very wrong, was he would force you to run these off-synergy cards in order to have a chance in the matchup. If you were a deck that naturally wanted to run some of these cards, that wasn't a problem. We talked about this in the Arrow answer. Arrow was the solution to this, where every deck kind of wanted to run her anyway, and she beat Galactus. And that is the major issue that led to Galactus's rise, is that now decks want to do specific things, and they can't do that and also have a good Galactus matchup unless they happen to be running those cards anyway, or running a couple of them in order to make sure they don't get completely obliterated. And when I say Galactus stripped the artifice down, what I mean is it turned the game into something that just felt like, you know, do they have it? Did they, like, I'm picking a card out of a deck, and is theirs higher? And that is not fun. I think Glenn Jones used the analogy of it turned Marvel Snap into war. the card game war, and it's just like, yeah, no, that's not what people signed up for. I don't think people overreact to his playstyle. I do think Galactus at 6'2" with his ult ability would be probably the best card in the game. It would be very unfun to play against. It would be entirely meta warping. I'm glad they keep nerfing it, because it is, in my opinion, the most dangerous card in Marvel Snap. The single biggest balance risk, the single biggest feels risk in the entire set. We always like to get one of these, don't we? Pixel variants are poop. So, I mean, I think I will tell you a story. Back in the beta, in the very early days of the beta, pixel variants could not be purchased in the shop. You could only get them by opening them on the collection track. And at this time, they were relatively prized. Like, I remember opening a Pixel Spectrum and being very excited because it was so exclusive. It was a rare thing to have. And as the shop scaled up, there were pixel variants for everything, and they actually added them to the shop. And I think that because they are so common, they became something that people didn't like. Because they are the most common type of variant, they are inherently a little bit undesirable. And I feel as though that, you know, art aside, subjective aesthetics aside, the major reason people don't like the pixels and the chibis is because they are common. And I find that at least a little bit interesting to think about, because I still remember opening that Pixel Spectrum and being like, oh my god, this is so unique, it's so mine. And I think that's a feeling that a lot of collectors like to have, is like, this is my unique deck that's very hard for someone to replicate. And pixels don't do that anymore, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they like totally suck. I just think it's an interesting commentary on sort of the subjectivity of what we think of as fairly objective determinants. Elith is old school arrow. So I did address this a little bit earlier, but there were so many Elith takes that I felt like this was worth putting on here as well. Elith is bad old school arrow. Like, I want to be super clear. Old school arrow is twice as good at her job as Elith, because old school arrow affects whatever lanes you want. Elith requires you to set up for it. Arrow just requires you to be ahead. Like, Elith, you need to be able to get them with the card. And I'm not saying that makes it perfect, right? I think it remains to be seen whether there is enough appetite among the player base for priority-based strategies. Because I think one of the things that a lot of people who watch videos like this are going to miss is that not everyone understands that Elith is a beatable card, or is thinking about it the entire game the way you have to in order to beat Elith. Elith might require a little more investment and a little more understanding of the meta to set up situations where you don't lose to it, such that it becomes sort of a card that is not fun to face for people who aren't, you know, like, they don't ever, there's no tutorial on priority, right? Nobody tells you about priority and how if you have priority, you can like Cosmo the Elith or whatever, or how you have to set up your board so that you cannot lose to an Elith, or things like that. I do think the card is frustrating, but not like overwhelmingly so for me. But I wonder if it might not be sort of overwhelmingly frustrating for people who don't understand how that works. And I do think that a lot of the reaction to Elith comes from, you know, it shows up in an unexpected place and you just get completely obliterated, and you're like, how was I supposed to know and play around that? And you're like, I guess I just wasn't. And that is a bad feeling to have, but I think that Arrow specifically does that job infinitely better. The end your turn button timer should be shorter. Yeah, I wouldn't hate that. I will say my biggest gripe with the end turn timer right now is specifically that you lock your play in, and then your opponent takes time and locks their play in, and that allows them to say, you know, your play is locked in, they snap, and that snap conveys information to you because this is a betting game. It's turn 5, they snap, you already locked your play in, and you realize, oh, there's a Professor X play here that I lose to, and you can't do anything about it. So I do think that my gripe isn't so much that it takes too much time. My gripe would be, if they snap, it should unlock the turn. That would be my take on how I would change the timer. That said, I know Hearthstone once tried to address this with a card called Nozdormu that both players had to run in their decks, and if both players ran it in their decks, they ended up getting like a 15-second timer instead of like a whole one. I wouldn't mind like a snap mode, like Blitz Snap. I think that would be very fun. I would definitely play that. Honestly, I think I'd be pretty good at it because I already play very, very fast. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in that. I don't think they should make it shorter, but I do think they should fix that sort of inherent imbalance in timers that makes it sort of optimal to wait your entire turn out, because I don't do it now, but I know if I were climbing, I probably should. And I think it just sucks that the incentivized optimal play in a game that's meant to be fast is being as slow as you possibly can. And I wish that wasn't the case. All right, y'all, Sunglasses KM is back. Those takes were extremely hot. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I really appreciate it. I have been KM Best. I will see you and your hot takes in the next one. You couldn't see the wink, could you? There you go.